Good day, everyone. My name is Paulo Anthony J. Mendoza, first-year Master in International Studies student, and I will be discussing today my research output for my Asian Studies 211 class entitled The Instability of Maritime Food Security in the South China Sea, Challenges to Fisheries Cooperation over Asymmetrical Relationships along the South China Sea Territorial Dispute. So to begin, on the 7th of March this year, 220 large Chinese fishing vessels, allegedly manned by Chinese paramilitary crew, was seen and reported to be moored around the Whitsun Reef or Julian Felipe Reef, a part of the contested Spratly Islands near the coast of Palawan, with parts within the declared 200 nautical miles EEZ of the Philippines, to which it should enjoy exclusive economic rights to exploit or conserve any resources. The National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea has expressed concerns regarding the presence of the vessels due to the possible overfishing and destruction of the marine environment, as well as risks to the safety of navigation in the maritime space. On March 22, National Defense Secretary Delphine Lorenzana has issued provocative statements to China, signifying the country's distress on security over the area. He asked for Beijing to stop the incursion and to immediately recall the vessels away from the area as their presence blatantly violates Philippine maritime rights and it is an encroachment to Philippine sovereign territory. The declaration by the DFA also rejected the assertion that Julian Felipe Reefs and its waters are China's traditional fishing grounds, as this strongly violates the UNCLOS maritime demarcation of the exclusive economic zone of sovereign states, to which China is a party of, and the final arbitral ruling in 2016 ruled by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. The Department of Foreign Affairs reiterated just cause for China to withdraw its vessels. Should the conflict escalate to a military conflict between Beijing and Manila, Washington assured that they are prepared to back up the Philippines due to the binding nature of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the two countries. In a statement released by the U.S. State Department, Ned Price said on April 9, an armed attack against the Philippines armed forces, public vessel, or aircraft in the Pacific, including the South China Sea, will trigger our obligations under the MDT. However, the statement was made alongside growing concerns against Chinese aggression over Taiwan. Amidst all this, China is standing by with its stance to continue solving bilateral talks with the Philippines over the issue. It has been noted that over the years, China does not want to include interventionist rulings over some international law and especially mediation by the United States. The rationale of this research is that with the continued threat of big Chinese vessels roaming around the disputed areas under the alleged protection and supervision of the Chinese military and government, it is ultimately exacerbates the growing food security threat to millions of Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, which are all largely dependent on maritime produce. Moreover, overfishing takes a serious and a more dangerous precedent because of the ongoing dispute over the contested waters and the prevalence of IUU practices by Chinese commercial fishery companies. Maritime produce in the coast of South China Sea and north of the South China Sea are dwindling at an alarming rate. That's why they are resorting into getting their catch along the deeper parts of the sea. The following research questions. Does the asymmetrical power relationship of China and the smaller states like the Philippines benefit the stronger power entirely over the weaker actor over soft power problems like food security? Can existing fisheries cooperation between disputing states work in the middle of the power contention over the territories between China and the Philippines? And lastly, can a cooperative fishing agreement work between China and the small states surrounding the South China Sea? The research objectives for this are as follow. Understand how China's unpredictability over the asymmetrical territorial dispute is taking at a dangerous precedent on maritime food security of the small states. Second, define future challenges to cooperation and conflict resolution over alternative and recovering strategies to resolve consequences brought about by overfishing and the territorial dispute. And lastly, analyze existing scholarly works that promotes developmental cooperation between South China Sea coastal states and pre-existing cooperative fishing agreements between these states. Upon doing my review of related literature, I am now going to discuss four findings that I have made in this research. The first is that the theory of a symmetrical relationship, the great power state over a small power state, will prevail. Thus, cooperative plans on prospective fisheries agreements will be difficult to enforce. The outcome of this research is premised on the structural realist principle proposed by Kenneth Waltz, that in an anarchic state, security is at the highest end. The term neorealism, also used to refer to this theory, stipulates that states are independent and self-helping actors that must look after themselves in the international arena by either balancing or bandwagoning with other self-serving states. However, this facade of cooperation does not last long because cooperation is in itself based on states' self-interests nonetheless. Moreover, structural realism preludes disadvantages over small states who are left to fend for themselves over the bigger powers. For this tradition, smaller states may either seek support through an alliance with another strong state or be compelled to bandwagon with a challenging state. The competition that is understood in a universal manner amidst this realist school of thought, which takes place within the face of interdependent cooperation, is widely assumed. Governments, then of smaller states, is compelled to accommodate these given conditions of interdependence by adjusting its responses and avoiding risks of provocative action, although the competition continues. In the case of the South China Sea dispute between China and the smaller states like the Philippines, this type of asymmetrical relationship is predominantly obvious, with China being the driver of the bigger resource and opportunity pool, utilizing them against the conflict in the region. In an article by Hendler in 2017, he used the politics of asymmetry theorized by Brantley Womack in his earlier study of China-Vietnam historical relations. Handler argues that in asymmetrical bilateral relationships, except open conflicts such as wars and violent military excursions, where A is a stronger power and B is a smaller power, the field of dispute is that A expects deference and submission of B, while B expects its autonomy, interest, and expectations to be recognized and respected, both in terms of security and economic development. He consequently concludes in his study that reaching a middle ground to avoid further misunderstanding that could lead to conflict is integral to this asymmetrical relationship and that both sides must overtly cooperate to reach a consensus. The sovereignty threat is perceived as mostly political, but generally geoeconomics in nature. It is based on the UNCLOS Article 56, sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring and exploiting, conserving and managing resources, delimiting sovereign rights to the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around the coastal territories of states. However, using the Walshian lens of neorealism, the environment to which the conflict is happening is an environment where a great power and a coalition of individually balancing small states against the great powers of the century, respectively the United States and China, the asymmetrical conflict over land-based and maritime resources exacerbated by the overpowering military might of China make the smaller states, especially the Philippines, is insecure not much of its military capabilities, but of the threat to its food security and maritime produce dependency. The second finding that I propose here in my study is that fisheries cooperation programs will have enforcement efforts, but this will be drowned in the dispute labeled as territorial and geopolitical rather than geoeconomics. The irrelevance of the sovereignty issue over territorial control will only hold true when such cooperation in the fishing and exploration partnerships become viably successful in the future. However, due to the asymmetrical power relationship of China as a global hegemon, this is less likely to happen. We have to remember that under the realist school of thought, as I've stated earlier, states operate within a self-help system where big powers will still dominate the international system, including those of territorial disputes, regardless of economic incentives provided through by interdependent cooperation, such as what Nguyen in 2011 and Zhang in 2018 liberalist, they are liberalist, no, proposed. The international legal basis, for example, for states to fish in the South China Sea lies under the provisions stipulated by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, signed in 1982. In particular, Article 56 of the Part 5 of the Convention laid out those provisions. No? While Article 61 and 62 on coastal state rights to cooperative exploitation of the partying states, respectively. No, from such notion, a geoeconomics issue to whose coastal state shall have the economic rights of the space have escalated to a massive military conflict over the global politics environment in the 21st century. Moreover, Article 63 of UNCLOS follows that the conservation and development of fish stocks is only effective through cooperation among the states concerned. Nguyen, in her research, provided a retrospective on such proposal. No? He argued that cooperative fisheries agreement from countries within the South China Sea lies on the premise that threats and conflicts along the sovereignty question are precedents of the laissez-faire fishing activities being conducted by states bordering the contested maritime space, that of especially China. Furthermore, Nguyen concluded that the fisheries agreement in the South China Sea is a legally sound, economically efficient, and politically commendable as a measure to help diffuse tension and promote sustainable fisheries in the South China Sea. The tension of the dispute along questions on sovereignty is irrelevant, although cooperation is still unlikely because states always see it through geopolitical lenses, which excessively undermines their security. In that sense, that the sovereignty question still pervades fisheries cooperation in the maritime space. No. Another scholar, Zhang, in 2018, espoused evaluations on the proposal of having a sound fishing cooperation between coastal states in the South China Sea. Zhang's arguments are based on the theoretical and empirical evidence that effective cooperation on the issues of law politics, such as fisheries cooperation, can generate strategic trust needed for cooperation on matters of high politics, such as territorial issues in particular. He notes that fisheries cooperation is important in two ways. First, meeting the food security and economic development needs, and second, sustainable fishery and conflict prevention. The former significance is that for South China Sea states to develop a plan to counter the dangers of growing populations and unprecedented economic growth within the region. He argues that demand for maritime sources of protein will increase alongside population growth. The latter's importance lies on his reasoning that there should be a sustainable interstate fishery program to prevent the issue of fisheries to further get politicized and securitized along the backdrop of the territorial aggressions being made by Beijing. While Zhang's justifications to meet the needs for maritime food security and sustainable fisheries cooperation to prevent conflict are sound, his proposals are still too broad. Pre-existing fisheries cooperation agreements between the small states and China still need to be narrowed down. There is still need there is still a need to recategorize classifications of maritime resource types because classifying them as under narrow terms delimit enforcement, as this just leads to confusion on what type of produce the party states have rights over under the partnership. Moreover, implementation of these fishing and cooperation plans will not be enforced to a degree that will imbibe China of letting go of its assertive mechanisms over the maritime space. The third finding that I had is that pre-existing and future fishing agreements must be respectively enforced either bilaterally between China and a smaller state or multilaterally between smaller states through ASEAN or between ASEAN and China. Pre-existing and prospective fishing agreements must still be respectively enforced under a shared and cooperatively agreed jurisdiction of international law. Specifically, the legally binding nature of UNCLOS provisions on the shared rights to use and exploit the resources for sustainable development of maritime food security and environmental protection within the region. Specifically, Articles 51, 61, 62, and 63 must be adhered to by all state parties regardless of their capability to assert power through military incursions. Furthermore, existing fishing agreements must also be strictly implemented by party states. Small states within the region that rely on a regional power such as ASEAN in entering such agreements must do it on a multilateral scale. This is to overshadow the assumption that such joint development partnerships work better when enforced by multiple small states within a regional bloc rather than bilateral agreements between two small states. On the multilateral level, there is the Asia Pacific Fishery Commission, which was established in 1948 with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which overlooks fishing operations in the Asia Pacific maritime areas. There is also the Southeast Asian Fisheries Development Center under the ASEAN, an autonomous intergovernmental body of said organization established in 1967 with the mandate of developing and managing the potential of fisheries in the region. On the other hand, agreements between a small state and a bigger state like China who has the economic superiority to impose strategic manipulation to the conduct of foreign policy of the smaller state must comply bilaterally with each other since bilateral relations are understandably more beneficial to smaller states than multilateral one against a bigger power like China because the self-help system of balancing and bandwagoning will apply. And consensus within a multilateral framework is harder to achieve. Also, it will be beneficial to the smaller states because bilaterally it knows it can benefit the most from China's economic resource pool than in a multilateral setting. On the bilateral level, some fisheries agreement between the states, smaller states, include the Gulf Tonkin Fishery Agreement in 2000 signed between China and Vietnam, and a Memorandum of Understanding on Fisheries Cooperation related to fishing, seawater aquaculture, and aquatic product processing between China and the Philippines signed in 2004. These existing bilateral and multilateral agreements must be intensified along the sphere. Regional dialogues in ASEAN must be enforced thoroughly, albeit lacking in action. The institution must work better in forums like the ASEAN CIFDEC Conference on Sustainable Fisheries for Food Security Towards 2020, Fish for the People 2020, must continue and be amended. Moreover, joint development cooperation within the agency must always be backed by scientific research, such as the consensus on the forum on the ninth meeting of the ASEAN Shrimp Alliance, or ASA, where delegates agreed to implement the ASEAN Shrimp Gap Assessment process and built the ASEAN Mutual Recognition Agreement to call on member nations to apply to the ASEAN Shrimp Gap and seek international recognition for the assessment process. The countries added that information exchange, cooperation in research, and shrimp farming improvements in the region need to be discussed based on interest and mutual concerns of ASEAN members. My last finding would be that the 2016 PCA arbitral ruling is the greatest bullet of small powers, especially the Philippines, in generating stronger international public support that can force China to respect UNCLOS and withdraw its military encroachments within the disputed maritime spaces. Invigorating public opinion on some over-the-top nationalistic sentiments over the territorial dilemma can only entail certain dangers that will just further exacerbate the issue. In the first place, there was already a big amount of internal and external public support that has resulted in the 2016 arbitral ruling favoring the Philippines. declaring that there have been violations of China on the provisions stated in the UNCLOS. In fact, the Department of Foreign Affairs has always used this as a primal basis to argue over our rights over the disputed islands. The reliance on international law alone is sufficiently enough to foster collective public support, both locally and internationally, should China be open to third-party mediation. Or if they really want to stick to their long-running stance of wanting to solve the issue over bilateral relations, then the 2016 PCA ruling on UNCLOS is really our greatest bullet of overturning the issue from a conventional to a non-traditional human security-centered approach. The international public support, such as in the case of Nicaragua versus United States in 1986, within the International Court of Justice, who ruled in favor of the former over violations in territorial interventionist strategies of the United States, also with their support for the Contras in their rebellion against the Sandinistas through their illegal mining in the Nicaragua's harbors. No? While the ICJ favored Nicaragua, the US continued to assert its influence, which received collective backlash from the international community. This has ultimately led to the compliance of the United States to abide by the international ruling. So in conclusion, the main assumption of this research is premised on the inevitability of prevalence of the theory of a symmetrical relationship, which tags a supposedly geoeconomics issue, territorial, and a geopolitical one. The question of sovereignty still overshadows the liberalist assumption of continued peace under multilateral cooperation and regional power-making in Asia-Pacific. While the research asked the possibility of a sound and sustainable cooperative fishing agreements using the scholarly works of Nguyen and Zhang, one cannot deny that the assertiveness of China to control key lanes in the South China Sea ultimately obstructs the possibility of fully implementing existing cooperative fishing agreements. Therefore, the research proposes that states, organizations, and civil societies alike should focus on reintegrating a human security approach in reconstructing the possibility of implementing cooperative agreements that focuses on first, meeting the food security needs of a coastal state surrounding the maritime space. Second, leniency of rules and regulations incentivizing local fisher folks, conducting livelihood fishing programs within the delimited EEZ of each state. And third, making sure that all domestic laws and subscribe to the international conventions and initiatives such as those of ASEAN and the United Nations. So that's all for my research. I hope everyone learned something from it. Thank you very much po. Stop recording.